A millionaire finds a fainted boy in his garage and takes him into his mansion. While trying to help the boy, he discovers secrets hidden in his own house. A mysterious businessman appears, making threats and implying he knows more than he says. Now he must protect the boy while unraveling a mystery that could change his life forever. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Night was falling gently over John Thompson's estate, a man whose fortune rivaled only his loneliness. The imposing mansion, surrounded by acres of meticulously manicured gardens, stood as a monument to his wealth and isolation. The city lights were just a distant glow on the horizon, unable to penetrate the bubble of silence that enveloped the property. John was driving his luxury car through the mansion gates, the soft purr of the engine echoing in the quiet of the night. His eyes, tired after a long day of meetings and negotiations, barely registered the beauty of the winding path leading to the main house. Routine had become his most faithful companion, each day a monotonous repetition of the previous one. As he approached the garage, something unusual caught his attention. A small, motionless figure lay on the ground, partially illuminated by the car's headlights. John frowned, intrigued and slightly alarmed. He parked the vehicle and cautiously approached the mysterious figure. To his surprise, it was a boy, no more than 10 years old, dressed in simple and worn clothes, contrasting drastically with the luxurious environment around him. The boy was unconscious, his breathing barely perceptible. In his right hand, he tightly clutched an object that glimmered in the dim light, an ancient amulet of intriguing appearance. John hesitated, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. How had this boy gotten here? Why was he unconscious? And what did that amulet mean? The situation was so unexpected, so out of the ordinary in his meticulously organized life, that for a moment he didn't know how to act. Finally, moved by a compassion he hadn't felt in a long time, John decided to bring the boy inside. Carefully he lifted the child's light body in his arms, noticing how the boy instinctively clung to the amulet, even unconscious. As he entered the mansion, John was greeted by Sarah, his wife. She was elegantly dressed, as always, but her expression changed instantly upon seeing the boy in her husband's arms. "John, what is this? Who is this child?" asked Sarah, her voice a mixture of surprise and something more, apprehension. "I found him unconscious in the garage," explained John, gently placing the boy on the living room sofa. "I don't know how he got here or what happened." Sarah approached, her eyes scanning the boy with cautious curiosity. Her gaze, however, abruptly halted on the amulet the boy was holding. For a brief moment, John saw something pass across his wife's face. Recognition? Fear? Before she quickly looked away. "Shouldn't we call the authorities?" suggested Sarah, her voice now controlled, almost indifferent. "Surely someone must be looking for him." John hesitated. Something in Sarah's reaction bothered him, although he couldn't explain exactly what. "Let's wait for him to wake up," he decided. "Maybe he can tell us what happened." Sarah nodded, but John noticed that she avoided looking directly at the boy or the amulet. "I'll get a blanket," she said, quickly leaving the room. Alone with the unconscious boy, John examined the amulet more closely. It was an intricate piece, apparently very old, with symbols and patterns he didn't recognize. It seemed valuable, certainly not something a street child would normally possess. Minutes passed and the boy began to stir. His eyes opened slowly, disoriented and frightened. "Mum," he called, his voice weak and confused. "Where am I?" John leaned in, trying to calm the boy. "It's all right, you're safe. I'm John. What's your name?" The boy blinked, looking around with a mixture of fear and familiarity. I don't know," he answered, seeming genuinely confused. "I can't remember." At that moment, Sarah returned with a blanket. The boy looked at her, and for an instant, his eyes widened in recognition. But the moment passed so quickly that John wasn't sure if it had really happened. "Do you know how you got here?" John asked gently. The boy furrowed his brow, concentrating. I remember running. It was dark. And there was someone chasing me, I think." He looked around the luxurious room. "This place, it seems familiar. The painting on the wall, and that statue in the corner. Have I been here before?" John and Sarah exchanged surprised looks. How could this boy know details about the house? "We've never seen you before," Sarah said quickly, her voice tense. "You must be confused because of the fainting spell." But John wasn't so sure. The boy spoke with a conviction that didn't seem to come just from confusion. And there was something else, something in the way Sarah was reacting that left him uneasy. "What's that you're holding?" John asked, pointing to the amulet. The boy looked at the object in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. I don't know, but it's important. Very important." He pressed the amulet against his chest, as if fearing someone might take it away. Sarah cleared her throat, visibly uncomfortable. "It's late. Perhaps we should all rest and deal with this in the morning." John reluctantly agreed. They settled the boy in one of the guest rooms, ensuring he was comfortable and safe. Later, alone in his study, John couldn't stop thinking about the events of the night. The boy's mysterious appearance, the strange amulet, Sarah's enigmatic reactions. All of this formed a puzzle he couldn't decipher. Moved by an impulse, John decided to check the security cameras on the property. Maybe they could provide some clue about how the boy had arrived there. He sat in front of the monitors and began to review the recordings. What he saw left him dumbfounded. There was no record of the boy entering the property. It was as if he had simply appeared out of nowhere. But there was something even more disturbing. John noticed several cameras in the garage that he didn't remember installing. A chill ran down his spine. Who had put those cameras there, and why? The feeling that something much bigger and more complex was happening began to take hold of him. John turned off the monitors, his mind full of unanswered questions. One thing was clear. The appearance of this mysterious boy was not a simple coincidence. There were secrets hidden in his own home, secrets he was determined to unravel. As he prepared for bed, John couldn't help but feel that his life, until then so predictable and controlled, was about to change drastically. Whatever was to come, he knew that nothing would be the same again. The sun had barely risen when John awoke, restless after a night of fitful sleep. The events of the previous night weighed on his mind like a dense cloud, full of unanswered questions. He got up silently, careful not to wake Sarah, who was sleeping deeply beside him. Walking through the silent corridors of the mansion, John headed to the room where they had accommodated the mysterious boy. As he gently opened the door, he found the child still asleep, the amulet firmly grasped in his small hand. The scene made him reflect on how long it had been since the house had harbored the sound of children's footsteps. Since his thoughts were interrupted by a noise coming from downstairs. Intrigued, John descended the stairs, following the sound to the kitchen. There he found Sarah, already dressed and preparing breakfast with an almost frantic energy. "Good morning," said John, closely observing his wife. "You're up early." Sarah startled slightly, as if only now noticing her husband's presence. "Oh, good morning, dear. I couldn't sleep very well. Thought I'd get up and do something useful." John noticed that Sarah's hands were trembling slightly as she handled the cups. "Is everything all right?" he asked gently. "Of course," she replied, too quickly. Why wouldn't it be? Before John could insist, they heard hesitant footsteps approaching. The boy appeared in the kitchen doorway, his eyes still sleepy but alert, examining the environment with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Good morning," said John, smiling at the boy. "Did you sleep well?" The boy nodded timidly, his eyes fixing on Sarah for a moment before returning to John. I had strange dreams," he murmured. "What kind of dreams?" asked John, noticing out of the corner of his eye that Sarah had stopped what she was doing, apparently very interested in the answer. "There was a girl," the boy began, furrowing his brow in concentration. "She was crying, asking for help. And there was a man, a scary man. He was angry, shouting." The boy visibly shuddered. "And then I was running a lot in the dark." Sarah dropped a spoon, the metallic sound echoing through the kitchen. "They're just nightmares," she said, her voice tense, "probably caused by the stress of last night. Come, let's have breakfast." As they ate, John tried to get more information from the boy, but the answers were vague and confused. The child seemed unable to remember his name or where he came from, but he continued to mention details about the house with a disconcerting familiarity. "That vase over there," said the boy, pointing to an ornate object in the corner of the dining room. "It's always crooked, isn't it? The maid used to straighten it every day." John and Sarah exchanged surprised looks. It was true. The vase had a slightly irregular base and always tended to be crooked. But how could the boy know that? After breakfast, while Sarah took the boy to take a bath and change clothes, John took the opportunity to make some discreet phone calls. First to his head of security, requesting a complete check of the house's systems. Then to a trusted private detective, requesting an investigation into missing children in the region. He was finishing the last call when the doorbell rang. Intrigued, John went to the door. They weren't expecting visitors, especially so early. As he opened the door, he found himself face to face with a tall, well-dressed man with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Good morning," said the stranger, his voice smooth but with a note of authority. "I'm Robert Anderson. I apologize for the unannounced visit, but I'm looking for something, or rather, someone." John felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in this man's gaze that left him deeply uncomfortable. "How can I help you, Mr. Anderson?" "I'm looking for a boy," continued Robert, his eyes examining the interior of the house over John's shoulder. "A boy who borrowed something very valuable that belongs to me. I have reason to believe he might be around here." At that moment, Sarah appeared in the hallway, freezing when she saw the visitor. John couldn't help but notice how she paled, her eyes widening in recognition and fear. "Ah, Sarah," said Robert, his smile widening in a way that made John feel instantly protective. "How long it's been. What a pleasure to see you again." Sarah looked as if she had seen a ghost. "Robert," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing here? You know each other?" asked John, looking from one to the other, feeling he was missing something crucial. "Old acquaintances," Robert answered smoothly, his eyes never leaving Sarah. "Isn't that right, dear?" The air seemed to grow thicker, laden with unspoken tension. John felt he was on the brink of something dangerous, something that threatened to crumble the world he knew. "Mr. Anderson," said John, regaining his composure, "I don't know what you're talking about. There's no boy here except our nephew, who's visiting us." Robert raised an eyebrow, his smile becoming almost predatory. "Your nephew? Interesting. I didn't know you had such close family. Especially considering, well, past events." John felt Sarah shudder beside him. "I think it's best you leave now, Mr. Anderson," he said, his voice firm. "If you have nothing else to say." Robert took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture of false surrender. Of course, I apologize for the intrusion, but if by chance you see a lost boy, shall we say, please don't hesitate to contact me." He handed a card to John. "I'm sure we all want what's best for the child, don't we?" With one last penetrating look at Sarah, Robert turned and left, leaving behind a heavy silence laden with unasked questions. John closed the door and turned to Sarah, who looked about to collapse. "Who was that man, Sarah? And what did he mean by past events?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a scream coming from upstairs. It was the boy. Without hesitation, John ran up the stairs, his heart racing. As he entered the room, he found the boy huddled in a corner, shaking violently. "What happened?" asked John, kneeling beside the boy. He's here," whispered the boy, his eyes wide with terror. "The bad man. He found me." John felt a weight in his stomach. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, forming an image he feared to face. Looking at Sarah, who was watching the scene from the door with an expression of guilt and fear, John knew that long-buried secrets were about to come to light, and he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The rest of the morning passed in tense silence. John, torn between the desire to comfort the frightened boy and the urgent need for answers, felt as if he were walking on thin ice. Sarah, in turn, seemed a shadow of herself, moving through the house like a ghost, avoiding her husband's questioning looks. It was only in the early afternoon, when the boy finally fell asleep, exhausted after hours of anxious vigilance, that John managed a moment alone with Sarah. He found her in the library, sitting in a leather armchair, staring fixedly at a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. "Sarah," he began softly, closing the door behind him, "I think it's time we talked." She raised her eyes, and John was surprised by the depth of pain he saw in them. "I knew this day would come," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I just hoped it would be later, that we'd have more time." John sat down across from his wife, leaning forward. "Who is Robert Anderson? And what does he have to do with the boy?" Sarah took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "Robert was an old business partner Before we got married, before you built your empire, I worked for him." "Worked?" John frowned. "You never mentioned this before." "Because I wanted to forget," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "Robert isn't just a businessman, John. He's dangerous. He's involved in things you couldn't imagine." John felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of things?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes returning to the photograph on the mantelpiece. It was an image of a smiling girl with the same eyes as Sarah. Their daughter who had disappeared years ago. "Do you remember the day Emily disappeared?" asked Sarah, her voice choked. John nodded, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied memories of that fateful day. "How could I forget?" "It wasn't an accident," said Sarah, the words coming out as if each one was a stab. "She didn't get lost in the park. She was taken." John's world seemed to spin. "What? But why? By whom?" "By Robert," Sarah answered, tears now flowing freely down her face. "He took her to punish me, to force me to go back to work for him." John abruptly stood up, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, confusion, betrayal. "Why did you never tell me this, all these years?" "Because he threatened to kill her if I told," Sarah sobbed. "He said if I went back to work for him, if I did everything he asked, Emily would be safe. I had no choice, John. I had no choice." John struggled to process everything he was hearing. Years of grief, of fruitless searching, and all this time. "And the boy? Does he have any connection to Emily?" Sarah wiped away her tears, trying to compose herself. "I'm not sure, but the amulet he carries, it was Emily's. I gave it to her on the day she was taken." As if summoned by the mention, they heard a scream coming from upstairs. John and Sarah looked at each other for a moment before running towards the boy's room. As they entered, they found the child sitting on the bed, panting and wide-eyed. "She was here," he said, pointing to an empty corner of the room. "The girl from my dream." "She was crying." John approached, sitting on the edge of the bed. "It's okay," he said, trying to calm the boy. "It was just a dream." But the boy shook his head vehemently. "No, it wasn't. She was really here. She said she needs help, that she's trapped." Sarah let out a muffled sob, covering her mouth with her hands. John looked from his wife to the boy, feeling they were on the brink of something monumental. "What else did she say?" John asked gently. The boy furrowed his brow, concentrating. "She talked about a dark place, with screams. She hears screams at night." He shuddered, clutching the amulet to his chest. "And she talked about a woman who looked familiar." The boy's eyes fixed on Sarah, who seemed to be having trouble breathing. "Like you," he whispered. The silence that followed was deafening. John felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under his feet. Everything he believed he knew, everything that was his reality, was crumbling. "Sarah," he said, his voice trembling, "I think we need to have a very serious conversation about everything." She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the boy. "Yes," she said softly, "I think it's time for the truth to come out." As they left the room, leaving the boy to rest, John couldn't help but notice how the child looked at Sarah. There was recognition in his eyes, mixed with something else. Hope. In the hallway, John gently held Sarah's arm. "Before we start, I need to know one thing," he said, his voice low and intense. "This boy, is he—" Sarah looked into her husband's eyes, years of secrets and pain reflected in her gaze. "I don't know, John. Honestly, I don't know. But if he's not, then who is he?" With that question hanging in the air, they descended the stairs, ready to unearth long-buried truths. John knew that after this conversation, nothing would be the same, but he was determined to uncover the truth no matter how painful it might be. As they headed to the library, John couldn't help but think about the map hidden in the boy's amulet. Something told him that map was the key to unraveling the entire mystery, and he was determined to follow it, no matter where it might lead. The library, once a haven of tranquility for John, now seemed suffocating. The shelves filled with books seemed like silent witnesses to a long-hidden truth. Sarah sat in the same armchair as before, her fingers nervously gripping the fabric of the armrest. John remained standing, unable to calm himself enough to sit. "Start from the beginning," he said, his voice softer than he expected. "I want to know everything." Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on a distant point. "I met Robert years before I met you," she began. I was young, ambitious, and he offered me a job that seemed to be any recent graduate's dream in business administration. She paused, gathering her thoughts. At first it was all legitimate, or at least it seemed to be. But over time I started noticing strange things. Suspicious transactions, secret meetings, people who appeared and disappeared without explanation. John listened attentively, his heart heavy. "Why didn't you leave when you realized something was wrong?" "I tried," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "But Robert, he has ways of keeping people tied to him. Veiled threats, subtle blackmail. When I finally gathered the courage to leave, I met you." She looked at John, her eyes pleading for understanding. "You were everything Robert wasn't. Honest, kind, ambitious in a good way. I saw a chance to start over, to leave that life behind." John felt a pang of empathy, but the feeling of betrayal still persisted. "And Emily? How does she fit into all this?" Sarah closed her eyes as if the memory was too painful to bear. "When Emily was born, I thought we were finally free, that Robert was part of the past, but he never really let me go. He waited, patient as a spider in its web, until the right moment." She opened her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. "On the day Emily disappeared, I received a call. It was Robert. He said he had our daughter, and that if I wanted to see her again, I would have to go back to working for him, in secret." John felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. All those years, all those fruitless searches. "Why didn't you tell me? We could have gone to the police, we could have—" "He said he would kill her if I told anyone," Sarah shouted, years of pent-up anguish exploding. "I couldn't risk it, John. I couldn't." The silence that followed was deafening. John struggled to process everything he was hearing. His mind was in turmoil, trying to reconcile the image of the woman he loved with this new reality, full of secrets and lies. "And the boy?" he finally asked. "Do you think he has any connection to Emily?" Sarah hesitated. I don't know. The amulet is identical to the one I gave Emily, but..." She stopped, frowning. "There's something familiar about him, John. Something I can't explain." At that moment, as if responding to a silent call, they heard hesitant footsteps approaching the library. The door opened slowly, revealing the boy, still clutching the amulet. I remembered something," he said timidly. John knelt in front of the boy, trying to appear as unthreatening as possible. "What did you remember?" The boy looked from John to Sarah, his eyes full of a mixture of fear and hope. "I remembered a name. Michael. I think it's my name." Sarah gasped, standing up abruptly. "Michael, but that's impossible. Emily was a girl and... unless..." John began, his mind racing with possibilities. He turned to the boy. "Michael," gently. "Do you remember anything else?" Michael nodded slowly. "I remember a dark place, and a voice, a gentle voice that told me to be strong, that one day I would come home." John and Sarah exchanged looks, a silent understanding passing between them. If this boy really was Emily, Michael now, what did that mean? What had Robert done to their child all these years? "There's one more thing," said Michael, his voice almost a whisper. He held out the amulet to John. "There's something inside, something important." With trembling hands, John took the amulet. Examining it closely, he noticed a small, almost imperceptible crack. Carefully he opened it, revealing a hidden compartment. From inside, he pulled out a folded piece of paper. As he unfolded it, his heart almost stopped. It was a map, an old map with a specific location marked in red. "My God," whispered Sarah, looking over John's shoulder. "I recognize that place. It's an old property of Robert's, in the mountains." John looked at the map, at Michael, and then at Sarah. The truth they sought, the answers to years of unanswered questions, seemed to be within reach. "I think," he said slowly, "it's time we took a trip." The weight of the decision hung in the air. They knew that following that map meant facing Robert, unearthing long-buried secrets, and possibly putting everything at risk. But looking at Michael, at the face that could be that of their lost daughter, John knew they had no choice. The journey for truth was just beginning, and the path ahead promised to be full of dangers and shocking revelations. But for the first time in years, there was a light of hope shining on the horizon, guiding them into the unknown. Dawn found the Thompson mansion in a state of silent agitation. John, who had barely slept, had been up since the early hours of the morning preparing for the journey ahead. Sarah, for her part, alternated between moments of fierce determination and periods of paralyzing anxiety. Michael, the enigmatic boy who could be Emily, slept deeply, exhausted by the revelations and emotions of the previous day. John couldn't help but notice how sleep softened the child's features, revealing a vulnerability that tugged at his heart. "We have to be careful," said Sarah, entering the study where John was studying the map for the umpteenth time. "Robert is dangerous and has eyes everywhere." John nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "I've thought about that. We'll use one of the less conspicuous cars and avoid main roads whenever possible." He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Sarah, I know it's risky, but I think we should take Michael with us. He might be the key to unraveling all of this." Sarah bit her lip, clearly torn. "It's dangerous, John. What if Robert finds us?" What if we leave Michael here and Robert comes after him?" John gently interrupted. "At least together we can protect him." After a long moment of silence, Sarah reluctantly nodded. "You're right. We can't risk losing him again." The following hours were a blur of discreet preparations. John made a few careful phone calls, arranging cover for his sudden absence. Sarah, meanwhile, gathered supplies and clothes, her hands trembling slightly as she packed. When they finally woke Michael, the sun was already high in the sky. The boy looked at them with a mixture of expectation and apprehension. "We're going on a trip," John explained softly, "to try to understand better what happened to you. Is that okay?" Michael nodded, clutching the amulet to his chest. "Are we going to find the girl from my dream?" John and Sarah exchanged glances. "Maybe," Sarah replied, her voice choked. "But the most important thing is that we're going to keep you safe." With the car loaded and the mansion properly secured, the three set off, leaving behind the safety of their daily life and plunging into the unknown. John drove, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror, paranoid about the possibility of being followed. The first hours of the journey passed in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Michael looked out the window, his wide eyes absorbing the ever-changing landscape. It was only when they stopped for a quick lunch at a small roadside diner that the tension began to dissipate a bit. Seated at a table in the back, away from curious glances, they finally had a chance to talk. "Michael," John began carefully, "can you remember anything else about where you came from?" The boy furrowed his brow, concentrating. There were high walls and trees. Lots of trees. Sometimes at night I heard distant howls." Sarah visibly paled. "Robert's property in the mountains," she whispered. "It's near a forest reserve." John felt a chill run down his spine. They were on the right track, but what would they find at the end of this journey? "And the people?" he asked gently. "Do you remember anyone in particular?" Michael hesitated, his eyes filling with tears. "There was a woman. She was kind. She called me my little treasure, but she always seemed sad." Sarah choked back a sob, her hands trembling as she held her water glass. John covered her hand with his, offering silent comfort. "It's okay," he said, both to Michael and Sarah. "We'll figure out the truth together." As they finished their meal and prepared to get back on the road, John couldn't help but notice a man sitting at the counter who seemed to be paying too much attention to their conversation. When their eyes met, the stranger quickly looked away, feigning interest in his coffee. With a knot in his stomach, John hurried his family back to the car. As they drove away from the diner, he couldn't help but notice the same man hurriedly exiting and heading to a car parked in the shadows. "I think we have company," John muttered to Sarah, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. Sarah turned, her face a mask of fear. "Robert?" "I don't know," John replied, accelerating slightly. "But we're not going to stick around to find out." The next few hours were a tense dance of back roads and improvised detours. John used all his driving skills to try to lose their pursuer, while Sarah kept Michael distracted with games and stories. As day gave way to night, the landscape around them became increasingly wild and mountainous. They were approaching their destination, but danger seemed to be approaching along with it. Finally, when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm John, they spotted a small inn hidden among the trees. Deciding they needed to rest and regroup, they stopped for the night. As they settled into their simple but cozy room, John couldn't help but feel they were on the brink of something monumental. The answers they sought were near, but so were the dangers surrounding them. Looking at Sarah and Michael, both finally asleep after the long day, John made a silent promise. He would protect them, no matter the cost, and together they would uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. With that thought, he allowed himself a brief moment of rest, knowing that dawn would bring new challenges and, he hoped, the answers they so desperately sought. The sun had barely risen when John awoke, startled. For a moment he was disoriented, the unfamiliar inn-room making him question where he was. Then the memories of the last few days hit him like a wave, and he sat up in bed, his heart racing. Sarah and Michael were still sleeping deeply, their faces peaceful in contrast to the turmoil John felt inside. He got up silently, determined to take advantage of these moments of calm to plan the next step. Taking the map they had found in the amulet, John headed to the small balcony of the room. The fresh morning air in the mountains helped clear his mind as he studied the markings on the aged paper. "We're close," he murmured to himself, tracing with his finger the path they still had ahead. Robert's property, marked in red on the map, was just a few hours away. A movement in the inn's parking lot caught his attention. The same car that had followed them the day before was there, partially hidden among the trees. John felt his heart tighten. They weren't safe here. Quickly returning inside, he gently woke Sarah. "We need to go," he whispered urgently. "Now." Sarah, sensing the tension in her husband's voice, didn't question. In minutes they had woken Michael, gathered their few possessions, and were ready to leave. Using the fire escape at the back of the inn, they managed to reach the car unnoticed. John started the engine and drove out as quietly as possible, the headlights off in the dim light of dawn. "They found us, didn't they?" Sarah asked, her voice tense. John nodded, his eyes alternating between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. "Yes, but we've gained some advantage. With luck, we'll be able to lose them on the mountain roads." Michael, sitting in the back seat, held the amulet tightly. "Are we going to the place from my dreams?" he asked, his voice a mixture of fear and expectation. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah replied, turning to look at the boy. "But don't worry, we'll keep you safe." The next few hours were a race against time and against their pursuers. John used all his driving skills, navigating narrow and winding roads, always aware of the danger that followed them. As they advanced deeper into the mountains, the landscape became increasingly wild and isolated. Centuries-old trees rose on both sides of the road, their shadows creating a green tunnel that seemed to swallow them. It was in the midst of this dense forest that something unexpected happened. Michael, who had been silent for hours, suddenly let out a sharp cry. "Stop the car!" he exclaimed, his wide eyes fixed on something beyond the window. John, caught by surprise, braked abruptly. "What is it? What did you see?" Michael pointed trembling to an almost imperceptible trail that branched off from the main road. "There. I know that path. I remember walking it." Sarah and John exchanged surprised looks. There was nothing on the map indicating this trail. "Are you sure, Michael?" Sarah asked gently. The boy nodded vigorously. "Yes, I'm sure. It leads to a place, an important place." John hesitated. Following an unknown trail could be dangerous, but it could also be the key to losing their pursuers and finding the answers they were looking for. After a moment of reflection, he made a decision. "We'll follow the trail," he said, maneuvering the car onto the narrow path. The trail was bumpy and poorly maintained, making the car bounce violently. Branches scratched the sides of the vehicle, and more than once John feared they would get stuck. After what seemed like an eternity, the trail opened into a small clearing. In the center, partially hidden by vegetation, was a small wooden cabin. "It's here," Michael whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "I remember this place." Cautiously, the three got out of the car. The cabin seemed to have been abandoned for years, its windows dusty and the wood worn by time. John approached the door, which was ajar. Carefully, he pushed it open, revealing a dark and dusty interior. What they found inside the cabin made their hearts stop. The walls were covered with photographs and newspaper clippings. Many of the photos showed Emily, or was it Michael, at different ages. Others showed Sarah, John, and even Robert. But what caught John's attention most was a desk in the corner. On it, illuminated by a ray of sunlight penetrating through a crack in the roof, was a diary. With trembling hands, John picked it up and opened it. The first words made his blood run cold. "Dear Emily, if you're reading this, it means you've finally found your way back home. There's so much I need to tell you, so many secrets that need to come to light." John looked up from the diary, meeting Sarah's gaze. They both knew they were about to discover truths that would change their lives forever. Michael, standing between them, looked around with a mixture of recognition and confusion. "I've been here before," he said softly. "But why? What happened to me?" The answers were there in that isolated cabin in the mountains, but as the sun set casting long shadows across the clearing, John couldn't help but feel they were being watched. The silence in the cabin was palpable, broken only by the occasional sound of pages turning as John avidly read the diary. Sarah, with Michael at her side, examined the photographs on the walls, her hands trembling slightly with each new image that revealed a piece of the past they didn't know. "My God," whispered John, his voice shaky. "Sarah, you need to see this." Sarah approached, Michael following closely, curious and apprehensive. John began to read aloud. "Dear Emily, the day they took you was the day my world crumbled. I made terrible choices, believing I was protecting you, but now I see that I only put you in greater danger. Robert is not who he claims to be. The work he forced me to do was far more sinister than I could ever have imagined. He's involved in a complex scheme of manipulation and control, using children as pawns in his power games. But you, my dear Emily, you were special. You had something he desperately wanted, the gift of vision. Your premonitions, which started as innocent dreams, were actually glimpses of future events. Robert planned to use your gift for his own nefarious purposes. That's why he took you, not to hurt you, but to mold you, transform you into his secret weapon." John stopped reading, looking at Sarah and Michael with wide eyes. Is this true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah, pale and trembling, nodded slowly. "Emily's dreams. They were always so vivid, so real. But I never imagined—" Michael, who had been listening attentively, spoke for the first time. "The dreams, is that why I see things? Why I knew about this cabin?" John and Sarah exchanged looks, the realization hitting them like lightning. Michael wasn't just Emily physically transformed, she still carried the gift that Robert so coveted. John turned his attention back to the diary, continuing to read, "I spent years trying to find you, my daughter. Every clue, every whisper of your whereabouts led me to another dead end. But I never gave up. It was during my search that I discovered the true extent of Robert's plans. He's not alone in this. There's an entire organization behind him, powerful people who would do anything to keep their secrets hidden. If you're reading this, it means somehow you escaped. But the danger hasn't passed. They will come after you, Emily, and they won't stop until they have you back." The sound of a twig snapping outside the cabin made all three freeze. John quickly closed the diary, tucking it into his jacket. "We need to go," he whispered urgently. "Now." But before they could move, the cabin door burst open violently. In the doorway, framed by the setting sun, stood Robert Anderson, his cold smile contrasting with the dangerous gleam in his eyes. "Well, well," he said, his voice soft but laden with threat. "What a touching family reunion. I must say, John, you've surprised me. I didn't imagine you'd come this far." John instinctively placed himself in front of Sarah and Michael, his body tense, ready to protect them. "It's over, Robert," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We know everything." Robert laughed, a humorless sound that sent chills down everyone's spine. "Oh, you don't know even half of it, my dear. But don't worry. Soon everything will become clear." He stepped aside, revealing more men behind him, all armed. "Now, if you'll be cooperative, no one needs to get hurt. All I want is the child." Michael let out a frightened moan, clinging to Sarah. John felt panic rising inside him, but he forced himself to remain calm. "That's not going to happen, Robert," he said, his voice laden with determination. "You're not taking Michael or Emily again." Robert's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Always the hero, aren't you, John? But you don't understand. This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us. That child's gift, well, it's the key to everything." At that moment, something unexpected happened. Michael stepped forward, his eyes shining with an intensity that John and Sarah had never seen before. "I saw this," said Michael, his voice surprisingly firm. "In my dreams, I saw this moment, and I saw what comes after." Robert seemed momentarily disconcerted, his confidence faltering for an instant. "What did you see, child?" he asked, a mixture of eagerness and fear in his voice. Michael looked directly into Robert's eyes, and for a moment he seemed much older than his years. "I saw your downfall," he said simply. The silence that followed was deafening. John, sensing Robert's momentary distraction, seized the opportunity. With a quick movement, he grabbed an old lamp from the nearby table and hurled it at the window, shattering the glass. "Run!" he shouted, pushing Sarah and Michael towards the newly created opening. Chaos ensued. Gunshots echoed through the cabin as John, Sarah, and Michael threw themselves through the broken window, shards of glass raining around them. They ran towards the forest, the growing darkness offering a welcome cover. Behind them they could hear Robert's furious shouts and the sound of pursuit. But they dared not look back, focusing only on running, on escaping, on surviving. As they plunged deeper into the dark forest, John knew that the real battle was just beginning. Emily's secret was exposed, and now they were at the center of something much bigger and more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. Night was falling rapidly, enveloping them in shadows. But amidst the darkness, one thing was certain. They would face whatever came together as a family, and somehow they would find a way to protect Michael and expose the truth no matter the cost. The nocturnal forest swallowed the sounds of their hurried footsteps, John's heart beating so loudly that he feared it might be heard by their pursuers. Sarah held Michael's hand firmly, guiding the child through the rugged terrain as they tried to distance themselves as much as possible from the cabin and Robert. The moonlight filtered through the tree canopy, barely illuminated the path ahead, making each step a calculated risk. Low branches whipped their faces, and treacherous roots threatened to trip them at any moment. "Where are we going?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with fear and exhaustion. John paused momentarily, trying to orient himself. "We need to find a road, something that will take us away from here," he replied, his mind racing to find a solution. It was then that Michael spoke, his voice surprisingly calm amidst the chaos. "There's a river," he said, pointing to the right. "If we follow it, we'll reach a bridge. On the other side, there's a town." John and Sarah looked at each other, amazed. "How do you know this?" John asked gently. "I saw it in a dream," Michael replied simply. "But it wasn't really a dream. It was like a memory of the future." There was no time to question. With the distant sounds of pursuit echoing behind them, they decided to trust Michael's vision. They headed in the indicated direction, and soon the soft sound of running water reached their ears. As they advanced, John couldn't help but think about the diary he had tucked into his jacket. The revelations contained in those pages weighed on his mind, raising more questions than answers. Who was Robert, really? What organization was behind him? And most importantly, what exactly was Michael's gift, and why was it so valuable? His thoughts were interrupted when they reached the riverbank. The current was strong, the dark waters reflecting the starry sky above. "There!" Sarah exclaimed, pointing downstream. In the distance, they could see the outline of a wooden bridge, exactly as Michael had predicted. They followed the riverbank, their steps quicker now that they had a clear destination. But the feeling of relief was short-lived. A distant shout cut through the air, followed by the sound of barking. "Hunting dogs," John murmured, fear tightening his chest. "They're getting closer." Sarah hugged Michael protectively. "What do we do now?" John looked at the river, a risky idea forming in his mind. "We need to cross, now. The water will erase our scent and give us more time." Without waiting for a response, he entered the icy water, shivering at the shock. "Come on," he called, extending his hand to Sarah and Michael. With hesitation, they followed him. The current was strong, threatening to knock them down with each step. John held Michael firmly, while Sarah clung to him. The crossing seemed to last an eternity. The icy water penetrated their clothes, robbing them of warmth and energy. But the fear of being captured propelled them forward. Finally, soaked and shivering, they reached the other bank. They barely had time to catch their breath when they heard voices approaching from the opposite shore. "Quick," John whispered, pulling them into the cover of the trees. Hidden in the dense vegetation, they watched with their hearts in their mouths as Robert and his men arrived at the riverbank. The dogs sniffed frantically, but seemed confused by the loss of the trail. "They must have crossed," one of the men shouted. Robert, his face a mask of fury, looked at the dark water. "Find them," he ordered, his voice cold as ice. "I don't care how, but bring the child back, alive." John felt Sarah shudder beside him. Michael surprisingly remained calm, his eyes fixed on Robert, with a disturbing intensity. They waited, barely daring to breathe as Robert and his men split up, some heading upstream, others downstream. Only when the sounds of the search disappeared in the distance did they dare to move. "We need to keep going," John said, his voice hoarse. "The town can't be far now." As they walked, exhausted and soaked, towards the bridge they had spotted earlier, Michael suddenly stopped. "What is it?" Sarah asked, worried. Michael looked at them, his eyes shining in a way that vividly reminded John of the words in the diary. "There's something you need to know," he said, his voice surprisingly mature. "About who I am, about what I can do." John and Sarah exchanged glances. They knew this moment would come, but they hadn't expected it to be so soon, so suddenly. "It's okay, dear," Sarah said softly. "You can tell us." Michael took a deep breath, as if preparing to reveal a great secret. "I am Emily," he began, "but I'm also Michael, and I'm much more than that. I can see things that haven't happened yet, and sometimes things that have already happened but have been forgotten." John knelt in front of him, looking into his eyes. "Is that why Robert is after you?" Michael nodded. "He wants to use what I can see, to control people, to change things in his favor. But there's something else." He hesitated, his eyes filling with tears. "There's something big coming, something that can change everything, and somehow I'm the key to it." The weight of that revelation hung over them like a dark cloud. John knew they were in the midst of something much bigger than they could have ever imagined. But looking at Michael, his child, no matter what form, he knew they would do anything to protect him. "We'll figure this out together," he said, hugging Michael and Sarah. "But first, we need to get to town and find a safe place." As they resumed their journey towards the bridge and the town beyond it, John couldn't help but feel they were on the brink of something monumental. Michael's revelations, the secrets contained in the diary, Robert's threats. Everything was converging into something that could change not just their lives, but perhaps the entire world. The night was dark around them, but John clung to the hope that together they would find a way to navigate through this darkness and reach the light on the other side. The small town of Shadow Creek emerged before them like a beacon of hope in the darkness of night. The streetlights and house lights twinkled, promising temporary refuge from Robert's relentless pursuit and his men. John, Sarah, and Michael walked through the quiet streets, their footsteps echoing in the silence of the early morning. They were exhausted, their clothes still damp from crossing the river, and the cold of the night made them shiver. "We need to find a place to rest," Sarah whispered, hugging Michael to keep him warm. John nodded, his eyes scanning the facades of houses and establishments. Finally, he spotted a small inn at the end of the main street, a rooms available sign glowing faintly in the window. Cautiously, they approached the establishment. John hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. "Remember," he said quietly, "we need to be discreet. We don't know who might be working for Robert." The door opened, revealing a kindly-looking elderly lady. Her eyes widened at the sight of the three's deplorable state. "My goodness, what happened to you?" John thought quickly. "Our car broke down on the road," he improvised. "We had to walk for hours in the rain. Would you happen to have a room available for us to spend the night?" The lady, who introduced herself as Mrs. Johnson, didn't ask any more questions. With a gesture of compassion, she led them inside, providing dry towels and hot tea. Once settled in a simple but cozy room on the second floor of the inn, John finally allowed himself to relax a little. Sarah helped Michael dry off and change clothes, while John stood guard at the window observing the empty street outside. "I think we lost them, at least for now," he said, turning to his family. Michael, sitting on the edge of the bed, seemed lost in thought. His eyes had that distant glow that John was beginning to associate with his visions. "What are you seeing, honey?" Sarah asked gently, sitting next to her child. Michael blinked, focusing again on the present. "There's something important in this town," he said slowly. "Something that can help us understand all of this." John approached, intrigued. "Do you know what it is?" Michael furrowed his brow, concentrating. "Not exactly, but I know it's related to the past, to my transformation." A heavy silence fell over the room. It was the first time they had directly addressed the fact that Michael was, somehow, Emily transformed. John took a deep breath, feeling it was time to share what he had discovered in the diary. He took the book from the inside pocket of his jacket, grateful that he had managed to keep it dry during their escape. "I think it's time we read this together," he said, sitting on the bed next to Sarah and Michael. In the hours that followed, by the dim light of the bedside lamp, they immersed themselves in the pages of the diary. The revelations were shocking and often painful. The diary, written by Sarah herself during the years of searching for Emily, detailed a complex web of conspiracy and manipulation. Robert, they discovered, was just a piece in a much larger game. The organization behind him, known only as the Circle, was a secret group of powerful individuals who believed they could shape the future through the control of people with special gifts, like Emily. "They forced me to work for them," Sarah read, her voice trembling with repressed emotion. "They said if I cooperated, Emily would be safe. But each task they gave me made me feel I was moving further and further away from her." The diary also revealed disturbing details about the transformation process Emily had undergone. It was a combination of advanced science and almost mystical practices, designed to amplify and control the child's natural gifts. They believed that by altering Emily's physical form, they could somehow reset her abilities. John continued reading aloud. "Transform her into a purer vessel for visions of the future." Michael listened to everything with surprising calmness, as if finally understanding parts of himself that had always been a mystery. "But something went wrong, didn't it?" he asked softly. "They couldn't control me like they wanted." Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes. "You were always stronger than they imagined, sweetheart. Even as a child, your visions were too powerful to be manipulated." John closed the diary, his mind spinning with all the information. "This explains why Robert is so desperate to get you back," he said. "You're not just a child with a gift. You're living proof that their plans can fail." A sudden insight hit John. "And that's why this town is important," he said, looking at Michael. "There's something here related to the Circle, isn't there? Something that can help us expose them?" Michael nodded slowly. "Yes, I think so, but—" He hesitated, his eyes filling with concern. "I also feel that there's danger. The closer we get to the truth, the more they'll try to stop us." Sarah hugged her child protectively. "We won't let them take you again. Never again." John stood up, a new determination in his eyes. "Tomorrow we'll start our search. Whatever this town is hiding, we'll find it. And we'll use it to end the Circle's plans once and for all." As they prepared for sleep, exhausted but with a new sense of purpose, John couldn't help but feel a mixture of fear and hope. They were at the epicenter of something much bigger than they could have ever imagined. But together as a family, they would face whatever the future held. Outside, the night remained silent. But John knew it was just the calm before the storm. The next day would bring new challenges, new dangers, and perhaps the answers they so desperately sought. Dawn in Shadow Creek brought with it a dense fog that hung over the streets, as if the town itself was trying to hide its secrets. John woke up early, his senses on high alert after a night of revelations and planning. Sarah and Michael were still sleeping, exhausted by the events of the past few days. John observed them for a moment, his heart full of love and determination. He would do anything to protect them, to unravel this mystery, and finally give them the peace they deserved. Silently, he descended the stairs of the inn, hoping to find Mrs. Johnson and perhaps obtain some information about the town. To his surprise, the lady was already up, preparing breakfast in the small kitchen. "Good morning, young man," she greeted with a warm smile. "I hope you all slept well." John nodded, returning the smile. "Yes, thank you for your hospitality. Mrs. Johnson, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask a few questions about Shadow Creek." The lady's expression subtly changed, a shadow passing over her eyes. "What kind of questions, my son?" Choosing his words carefully, John proceeded. "We're looking for information about unusual events that may have happened here in the past, perhaps related to an organization called the Circle." The sound of a cup breaking echoed through the kitchen. Mrs. Johnson had dropped what she was holding, her face as pale as if she had seen a ghost. Where did you hear that name?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Before John could answer, he heard footsteps on the stairs. Sarah and Michael appeared, attracted by the noise. "Is everything all right?" Sarah asked, concerned. Mrs. Johnson looked at the trio, her eyes fixing on Michael. For a long moment she remained silent, as if making a crucial decision. Finally she spoke. "You're not ordinary tourists, are you? Nor a family on a simple car trip?" John exchanged looks with Sarah before replying, "No, we're not. We're looking for answers, and we believe they might be here, in this town." Mrs. Johnson sighed deeply. I knew this day would come, she murmured, more to herself than to the others. Come with me. There's something you need to see. Intrigued and a little apprehensive, the family followed Mrs. Johnson to the back of the inn. There, hidden behind a false panel, was a door that led to a secret basement. Descending the narrow stairs, they found themselves in a room filled with old documents, photographs, and maps. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings and meticulous notes. My husband, Mrs. Johnson began, her voice laden with emotion, was an investigative journalist. Decades ago, he began to unravel the secrets of the circle. But the more he discovered, the more dangerous it became. She approached a shelf and pulled out a dusty folder. These are his last discoveries before he disappeared. John took the folder reverently, feeling the weight of history in his hands. As he opened it, his eyes widened. There were photos of children, dozens of them, all with vacant expressions and distant gazes. The circle didn't start with Emily, Mrs. Johnson explained. For decades they've been seeking out and exploiting children with special gifts. But Emily was different, more powerful than any they had ever encountered. Michael approached, his eyes fixed on the photographs. I remember some of them, he whispered. From the dreams, the visions. Sarah hugged her child, silent tears streaming down her face. What happened to these children? Mrs. Johnson shook her head sadly. Many disappeared. Others... Well, the circle has ways of making people forget. John continued to examine the documents, his mind racing to connect the pieces. There's something here about a secret facility, he said. Some kind of laboratory hidden in the mountains, not far from here. The sanctuary, said Mrs. Johnson. That's what they call it. It's where they conduct their experiments, where they try to perfect their control over the children's gifts. Michael suddenly tensed, his eyes gaining that distant glow that John now recognized as the prelude to a vision. He's coming, he whispered. Robert, he's discovered where we are. Panic threatened to overtake John, but he forced himself to remain calm. How much time do we have? Not much, Michael replied, blinking to come out of the trance. A few hours, maybe less. Mrs. Johnson acted quickly, grabbing a map from the wall. There's a secret passage that leads out of town, straight to the mountains. If you're quick, you can reach the sanctuary before them. John looked at Sarah, a silent conversation passing between them. It was risky, possibly a trap, but it could also be their only chance to expose the circle and end all of this once and for all. We'll do it, Sarah said, her voice firm. For Michael's sake, for all the other children, and for ourselves. John nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. He turned to Mrs. Johnson. Thank you for everything. Is there anything we can do to help protect you? The lady smiled sadly. Don't worry about me, I've lived my life. The important thing is that you managed to stop this. Please do what my husband couldn't. With time running out, they quickly gathered supplies and prepared to leave. Before they left, Michael hugged Mrs. Johnson. Thank you, he said softly. Your husband didn't die in vain. I promise. As they followed the secret passage, leaving Shadow Creek behind, John couldn't help but feel they were walking directly into the heart of the storm. The sanctuary awaited them, with all its secrets and dangers. But for the first time since it all began, they had a plan. They had knowledge. And most importantly, they had each other. The final battle was about to begin. And John was determined to ensure that this time, good would prevail. The secret passage wound through the bowels of the mountain, the air growing colder and damper as John, Sarah, and Michael advanced. The light from their flashlights created dancing shadows on the rocky walls, as if the very secrets they sought were trying to take form. Michael led the way, guided by a mixture of intuition and fragmented visions. His steps were sure, as if he had walked this path before, perhaps in one of his premonitory dreams. We're close, he whispered, after what seemed like hours of walking. I can feel something, a strange energy. John and Sarah exchanged worried glances. The atmosphere was growing thicker, charged with a palpable tension. Finally, the passage opened into a large cavern, and there, embedded in the rock as if it had grown from it, was a structure that could only be the sanctuary. It was a disconcerting mixture of advanced technology and ancient architecture. Gleaming metal walls merged with natural stone, creating a visual that seemed to defy reality itself. My God, Sarah murmured, her eyes wide. It's bigger than we imagined. John felt a chill run down his spine. How are we going to get in? Before anyone could answer, a shrill alarm cut through the air. Red lights began flashing around the structure, and the sound of metal doors closing echoed through the cavern. They know we're here, Michael said, his voice strangely calm. But don't worry, this is part of what I saw. With a confidence that surprised even himself, Michael approached a panel on the wall of the sanctuary. His fingers danced over the controls with an unsettling familiarity. "Here," John began, but was interrupted by the sound of a door opening. "Let's go," Michael said, entering the complex. "We don't have much time." John and Sarah followed him, amazed and apprehensive. The interior of the sanctuary was a labyrinth of sterile corridors and rooms filled with equipment that seemed straight out of a science fiction movie. As they advanced, Michael explained in a low voice, "This place, it amplifies the gifts. That's why I can see and feel more clearly here. But it's also dangerous. They use this energy to control, to manipulate." Turning a corner, they came upon a huge room. In the center was a kind of capsule surrounded by pulsating monitors and machines. "It's here," Michael said, his voice trembling slightly. "It's where they transformed me." Sarah choked back a sob, hugging her child. John felt a fury growing inside him at the thought of what they had done to his little girl, but there was no time to process these emotions. The sound of approaching footsteps alerted them to the imminent danger. "Hide," John whispered, pulling Sarah and Michael behind some equipment. Seconds later, Robert entered the room, followed by a group of men in white coats, scientists presumably. "Activate the system," Robert ordered, his voice cold and calculating. "She's here. I can feel it." One of the scientists approached a console. "Sir, if we turn it on at full power, it could be dangerous." "The energy field could—" "Do as I say," Robert interrupted, his composure breaking for a moment. "We can't lose that child again. She's the key to everything." As the scientists worked, the room began to hum with energy. Michael gasped, his eyes widening. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, worried. They're trying to call me," Michael replied, his voice distant. "Use the energy field to amplify my gift and force me to reveal myself." John held his child's hand firmly. "Resist, sweetheart. You're stronger than they are." But as the energy increased, Michael seemed to struggle more and more to maintain control. His eyes began to glow with a supernatural light and his body trembled. I can't resist for long," he moaned. Sarah looked at John, panic evident in her eyes. "We have to do something." At that moment, John made a decision. He knew it was risky, possibly suicidal, but he saw no other option. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "I'm going to create a distraction." Before Sarah could protest, John emerged from their hiding place. "Hey, Robert," he shouted. "Looking for us." Robert's face contorted into a mixture of surprise and triumph. "John, what a pleasure to see you again. I see you've spared us the trouble of hunting you down." John took a step forward, positioning himself between Robert and where Sarah and Michael were hidden. "It's over, Robert. We know everything. About the circle, about the experiments, about what you did to the children." Robert laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Oh, John, you don't understand, do you? This is much bigger than you can imagine. What we're doing here, we're shaping the future of humanity. At the cost of innocent children," John shot back, his voice laden with contempt. "Sacrifices are necessary for the greater good," Robert replied, his voice dangerously soft. "But enough talk. Where's the child, John? Where's Michael?" At that moment, something unexpected happened. The energy field around them began to pulse erratically. The lights flickered and the equipment emitted alarm sounds. "What's happening?" Robert shouted to the panicking scientists. "The system is overloading," one of them replied. "The energy, it's out of control." And then, as if responding to a silent call, Michael emerged from his hiding place. His eyes glowed with an intense light, and the air around him seemed to vibrate with power. "Enough," he said, his voice echoing in a way that didn't seem entirely human. "This ends now." Chaos ensued. As Michael advanced, the sanctuary's energy seemed to respond to him, growing in intensity. Equipment exploded in sparks, and the very air seemed charged with electricity. John ran to Sarah, embracing her protectively, as they watched their child confront Robert and all the power of the circle. It was the moment of truth. The final confrontation was about to happen, and the fate of Michael, and perhaps the world, hung in the balance. The sanctuary shook, its metal walls groaning under the pressure of the accumulating energy. At the center of it all stood Michael, his eyes shining with a power that seemed to come from another world. Robert, for the first time since John had known him, appeared truly shaken. "What have you done?" Robert shouted, his voice a mixture of fear and fascination. "How is this possible?" Michael took a step forward, and the air around him rippled as if it were water. "You played with forces you didn't understand," he said, his voice echoing supernaturally. "You thought you could control the future, shape destiny. But destiny belongs to no one." John and Sarah watched, paralyzed, as their child faced the man who had caused so much suffering. It was as if Michael had transformed into something more, something beyond what any of them could have imagined. The scientists ran frantically, trying to shut down equipment and contain the spreading energy. But it was too late. The power they had tried to control for so long was now free, channeled through Michael. "You don't understand," Robert tried to argue, taking a step back. "Everything we did was for the greater good, to protect humanity, to guide it to a better future." Michael shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. "No, Robert. You did this for power, for control. But the true future can't be controlled or manipulated. It's made of the free choices of each individual." At that moment, images began to form in the air around them. They were visions of the future, but not just one future. They were multiple possible futures, intertwined and constantly changing. John saw flashes of a world at peace, of incredible technological advances, of people united. But he also saw glimpses of destruction, of conflict, of suffering. And he understood. The future wasn't a straight line, but a web of possibilities. "This is what you wanted to see and control," Michael said, his voice softer now. "But you didn't realize that by trying to control the future, you were robbing it of its true beauty. Uncertainty, hope, the ability to change." Sarah stepped forward, tears running down her face. "Michael, my dear." Michael turned to his parents, a gentle smile on his face. "It's okay, Mom, I understand now. I understand why I was chosen, why I went through all this." John felt his heart tighten. "What do you mean?" "My gift," Michael explained, "wasn't meant to be used to control the future. It was to show everyone that the future is always in motion, always changing with every choice we make." The visions around them began to intensify, spinning faster. Robert fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was witnessing. "What's happening?" he shouted, his face a mask of terror. Michael approached him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm showing you, all of you, the truth. The future isn't something to be feared or controlled. It's something to be embraced with all its possibilities." At that moment, an intense light filled the room. John and Sarah embraced each other, blinded by the brightness. When they finally could open their eyes, they were shocked by what they saw. The sanctuary was transformed. The metal walls had dissolved, revealing the natural cave behind. The circle's equipment was in ruins, but in their place bright crystals had grown, pulsing with a soft and comforting energy. And at the center of it all, Michael stood, seeming at once the child they knew and something much older and wiser. "It's over," he said softly. "The circle, their plans, all of this. It's over." Robert and the scientists lay on the ground, unconscious but alive. John could see that something fundamental had changed in them, as if they had been forced to face a truth that would forever alter their understanding of the world. Sarah ran to hug Michael, John right behind her. Together, they held each other, a family reunited after an incredible journey. "What happens now?" John asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Michael smiled, looking at his parents with love. "Now we live. We make our choices, create our own future, and we help others understand the power of their own choices." As they left the cave, leaving behind the remains of the sanctuary, John realized that the world seemed different, brighter, more full of possibilities. Michael stopped at the cave entrance, looking at the horizon. "There's so much to be done," he said. "So many other children to help, so many people to teach about the true meaning of the future." Sarah squeezed her child's hand. "And we'll be with you every step of the way." John nodded, feeling a mixture of pride, love, and a new sense of purpose. Together, as a family, As they walked towards the uncertain but hope-filled future, John reflected on the incredible journey they had lived. They had faced the impossible, defied the very laws of reality, and emerged stronger and more united than ever. The sun was rising on the horizon, a new day announcing itself, and with it came the promise of a future not controlled or predetermined, but free and full of infinite possibilities. Michael, John, and Sarah walked hand in hand, ready to face whatever the future held, not as victims of fate, but as architects of their own stories. And so their new journey began, a journey of discovery, healing, and hope. A journey that would take them to places they never imagined, but that they would face together, as they always had. The future awaited them, bright and full of promise, and they were ready to embrace it with all its mystery and wonder.